All righty, good evening. Thank you for joining us for integrating accessibility into your artistic practice. I'm going to go ahead and get started, and people can just funnel in as they would like. My name is Molly Hull, and I am the Accessibility and Inclusion Coordinator at the North Carolina Museum of Art and an independent accessibility consultant. Before assuming these roles, I was gallery director and adjunct art history professor at Meredith College. I am a white woman in my 30s with curly brown hair, and I am wearing a black sleeveless shirt. And I am in my home office this evening, zooming in. During this workshop, I will be modeling what I refer to as an accessible presentation, meaning that I will include audio description of the slides and of myself. Audio description is a visual to verbal translation of key elements that are considered essential to an understanding of one's surroundings. Audio description is a tool that is traditionally used by people who are blind or partially sighted, but it can benefit everyone. So this is a quick agenda of the topics that will be covered this evening. We're going to start by going over the basics of accessibility, kind of providing a baseline for everyone joining us, and then go into a universal design approach for exhibiting artwork, and then end with where to begin. So I'll propose some zero to no cost solutions for how to start your accessibility journey, but also maybe hopefully spark ideas for how you can incorporate accessibility into your artwork. I have questions covered at the end, but if you have a burning question, feel free to ask it in the chat and I will try to man that. So I wanted to start off this evening by asking you all two questions, and I'm not necessarily asking you to respond. It is more of kind of a self-audit. And I will propose maybe some answers that you may or may not have asked or given yourself. So the first question I want to pose is, who is your intended audience? So you could answer this question in a number of ways depending on your interpretation of the question, right? So it could be yourself, meaning that you create art to express yourself. And if it connects with others, that's a bonus. So your primary goal is self-expression. Or it could be targeted, meaning that you really want to connect with teenagers, for example, and your artwork engages topics like mental health or identity, whatever. Or it could be a niche audience. You're really into, for example, the environment, and you want to create artwork that has an element of activism for climate change. With a little bit of an undertone of hope for humanity. Or it could be community or culturally focused, or professionally, meaning that you want your artwork to be collected by a museum, by an organization, or it's educational, meaning that you want students and teachers to interpret your artwork and use it as a learning tool. Or your immediate response was maybe, I want everyone to enjoy my artwork. Everyone is my intended audience, which is great. But then I challenge you to address the word everyone. Who is everyone? Does that specifically include people with disabilities? And if so, how are you removing barriers to ensure your artwork, and how it is marketed and displayed is accessible? So on the bottom of this screen is an image of the Golden Belt Gallery space populated with people. Hung on the walls is artwork, as well as it is displayed on the floor. The second question I want you to think about is, how do you envision your audience engaging with artwork? So now that we've talked about kind of your intended audience, I want you to think about more going beyond emotion and thinking about how your work may be engaged. So that may be visually, meaning that it is only intended to be looked at, or it could be through the senses, meaning that you go beyond sight to include things like sounds, touch, and smell, fully immersing your viewer. This could be a combination of all those senses, or it could just be one. So you create a tactile replica, for example. Or it's actively participate. You want your viewer to become part of your artwork, to interact, to engage. But if you're not trying to actively answer these questions about your audience, you could consciously or unconsciously be excluding an entire community of disabled people from engaging with your artwork. So on this slide before you are two images. The image on the left is of a group of tour participants standing around a docent and an audio describer who are flanking either side of a painting in front of a blue wall. On the right is an image of two tour participants touching a bust of a feline wearing an Egyptian headdress displayed on a white pedestal set against a gray wall. A docent stands to their right facing them and the sculpture. So now that I've hopefully got your sparks flying, we're going to start with a little bit of basics around accessibility and provide each of us with a kind of overall definition of what accessibility is, and then go into disability and how our perceptions of disability are formed, but all relating back to the exhibition space. So accessibility is defined as giving equitable access to everyone along the continuum of human ability and experience. Accessibility encompasses the broader meanings of compliance and refers to how organizations make space for the characteristics that each person brings. And this definition is brought to us by the American Alliance for Museums. At the bottom of the screen is the international accessibility icon revamped. So you're most probably familiar with the icon of a wheelchair user sitting, straight up in a wheelchair. This accessibility icon project takes the normal stagnant wheelchair user and activates them. And this provides a sort of metaphor for agency for the disabled community. So disability and accessibility go hand in hand. Because when you make something accessible for people with disabilities, you are making it accessible for more than the person that you intended to make that for. So disability is outlined by the American with Disabilities Act, also known as ADA. And it states that a person with disabilities is someone who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more life activities. B, or second, a person who has a record of an impairment that substantially limits an impairment even if they don't currently have that disability, or the third, who does not have a disability but is regarded as having a disability. So this is a very formal definition. It's a part of the law, but most definitions with disability are centered around ability. What someone can or cannot do, their quote limitations. And this definition fails to address disability as part of human life. We at any moment in our lifetime can be disabled or have a temporary disability, like a broken ankle, for example. And disability isn't stagnant, meaning it evolves and there's no singular meaning. So to expand on this definition, I've broken up disability into two categories: apparent versus unapparent. So an apparent disability is noticeable based on outwards appearance or even communication. So that's things like cerebral palsy, amputation, Tourette syndrome, epilepsy, speech impairments, multiple sclerosis, and much more. A non-apparent disability goes unnoticed or is unseen and is not immediately apparent when looking or communicating with someone. So that's someone who may be on the autism spectrum, who might have multiple sclerosis, cognitive impairments, anxiety, depression, blindness, deafness, PTSD, and many, many more. Now, these categories are not the end-all be-all. They are our blurred lines between what is classified as apparent versus unapparent because of context, for example, or because an example might be you might not know someone is deaf until they begin to sign, Or you might not know someone is blind until they bring out their walking cane. A disability can be apparent in certain times and not in others. If you go to a restaurant with someone who's hard of hearing, for example, they might have a difficult time hearing you because of all the background noise. So just because a disability is unapparent doesn't make it more legitimate than a disability that is apparent. Unapparent disabilities are valid as well. So not listed on this slide are temporary disabilities, such as broken bones, as well as acquired disabilities that happen at any time throughout one's life. So on the right side of the slide is a black and white image that reads, "Some disabilities look like this," and a row of figures with visible disabilities stand side by side. And below them is a line that reads, "Some disabilities look like this," and a sole figure stands with an invisible disability. So how individuals view disability is heavily influenced by barriers that are present within our society. And those barriers include things like attitudinal barriers, but also physical barriers. So attitudinal barriers are behaviors or perceptions or assumptions that discriminate against people with disabilities. And these barriers often emerge from a lack of understanding, which can lead people to ignore, to judge, or to have misconceptions about a person with a disability. So common examples include things like hero worship. So considering someone with a disability who accomplishes a task to be brave or special, even if it's just living daily life or completing a daily task like living independently. There's fear, so worrying that one will do or say something wrong to a person with a disability, or even completely avoiding talking to someone with a disability is an example of fear. And lastly, an object of pity, so a belief that someone with a disability deserves pity or sympathy because of their disability. Moving on to physical barriers. Physical barriers are structural obstacles in nature or man-made environments that prevent or block mobility or access. So some common examples that I'm sure you're aware of are things like absence of a ramp, so only offering stairs to get into a space, lack of an automatic door, lack of an accessible restroom, no sidewalk, or even a broken elevator or wheelchair lift, which you would commonly find in a theater setting. So how does those barriers show up in exhibition spaces? A major one is assuming that disabled people cannot or do not want to engage with art. So common examples that I've heard or come across is that maybe a blind person doesn't enjoy art because they can't see it. Or a deaf person would not enjoy a performance with music because they cannot hear it. These are ableist comments at their core. And if you're not inviting people with disabilities to engage with your art or work, why would they? Art is a universal tool that brings people together regardless of whether or not a person has a disability. And as the artist, you have an opportunity to create that bridge. Another example of inaccessibility within the exhibition space is the lack of providing information in multiple formats. So that includes things like large print font or braille labels, captioned videos, and maybe perhaps including a printed transcript along with those captions, or even the ability to have a visitor request an ASL interpreter or an audio described tour. Things like signage and artwork hung too high. So it's recommended that you hang artwork at a midline of 57 inches. This is recommended for people in wheelchairs. So thinking about how long a person might have to look upwards and what that might do to their neck. Lack of enough wheelchair clearance between displays. So keeping in mind that it is recommended to or required to have 30 inches by 48 inches of clear floor space. So making sure that those pedestals aren't too close together and that there's enough clearance between them for a wheelchair user to go between them. Inefficient lighting. So it's important to light your work and even the labels that are associated with those works. And then lastly, the lack of seating options. So we all love an aesthetically pleasing exhibition space, but we got to put chairs in it. We got to put seating in it. And there are a number of options, such as benches, but there's also chairs with and without backs. And also armrests are a thing to consider as well. So a bench in the right-hand corner of your screen is a bench by the artist Shannon Finnegan. It's painted a deep blue with white lettering that reads, "The exhibition has asked me to stand for too long. Sit if you agree." This bench is part of a series that advocates for physical accessibility within the gallery space that traditionally has minimal seating options. So these barriers that we just addressed stem from concepts that we should all be familiar with, such as implicit bias, but also ableism. So implicit bias, also known as unconscious bias, are prejudiced behaviors that happen without the person's awareness and can often contradict their outward beliefs, making this type of bias hard to change. Implicit disability bias directly relates to ableism. So ableism is traditionally it's traditionally solely understood as being related to prejudice, discrimination, and oppression against disabled people. And on the bottom half of this slide is a definition presented by the activist Talila A. Lewis, who expands upon our traditional understanding, positioning ableism at the root of every oppression. So the definition reads, "A system of assigning value to people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, productivity, desirability, intelligence, excellence, and fitness. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in eugenics, anti-Blackness, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. The systemic oppression that leads to people and society determining people's values based on their culture, age, language, appearance, religion, birth, or living place, quote, wellness, health/wellness, quote, and or the ability to satisfactorily reproduce, quote, excel, and behave. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism." This definition is directly linked to the disability justice movement that follows a cross-disability framework that values access, self-determination, and an expectation of difference. This expectation of difference means that we expect difference in disability, identity, and culture, centering diversity in disability and the lived experience. So intersectionality, right? So it recognizes that every person has multiple identities that combine in unique ways that shape our perspectives and experiences with oppression and privilege. Intertwined with that is the lived experience, meaning an experience that refers to a person's firsthand experience living day to day with a disability. It's not based on assumptions or constructs from other people or outside forces, it's personal. So the lived experience is not only defined or kind of elaborated on based on a person's disability, meaning that it's very personal, but it's also affected by things like socioeconomic class, race, gender, ethnicity, education, and so much more. Disability is not homogeneous, nor is it always visible, and not every person has the same experience, even if they have the same disability. So on the bottom of the slide is the phrase, "nothing about us without us," which was a phrase coined during the 1990s in South Africa during their disability rights movement. And this phrase I put here as a reminder to include the disabled perspective. As you explore accessibility in your work, I hope that you also keep in mind that accessibility is a journey. So you're not always going to get it right, meaning that you can't cater to everyone, and we're constantly learning as humans. So it's always good to think about diversity and disability moving forward, and you should always strive to create the most accessible experiences possible. So now that we have a baseline understanding of disability, I want to transition into thinking about how we can approach exhibiting art in a universal and accessible way. So we live in actually the birth state of universal design. So universal design was created by Ronald Mace, who was a professor at NC State University. He was an architect and the visionary of this principle. And it is essentially, universal design is a design that is usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. It includes 7 principles. The first is equitable use. The second is flexibility in use. The third is simple and intuitive. The fourth is perceptible information. The fifth is tolerance of error. The sixth is low physical effort. The seventh is size and space for approach and use. So in applying universal design, you are being proactive rather than reactive. You are incorporating accessibility from the beginning rather than tacking it on to the end. You are thinking through who is going to look at my work, interact with my work, and how can I engage them? You are answering those questions and being proactive. So on the bottom of this slide, white block figures with and without disabilities are lined up in a row against a teal background. A white banner appears at the top with teal lettering that reads Universal Design, and below the figures in white lettering reads Making Design Accessible to Everyone in Society. So thinking about, okay, what would be a universally designed exhibition? Well, that would be eliminating those barriers that we talked about earlier. It would be making sure that when that person entered into that space, they knew where things like large print font was if it was available, or braille labels, or maybe you presented them with a visual schedule on how to interact with the space that answered questions like, okay, noise canceling headphones I can get here. So they're not necessarily having to answer those questions, or they know when to visit an exhibition when there's an audio described tour. So there are multiple ways that you can apply universal design to exhibitions. But for the purposes of this evening, I wanted to think through how we could apply the senses to artwork and its creation when you're in that creation process. So thinking through the senses, I wanted us to touch upon touch, sight, sound, taste, and smell. So by incorporating these 5 senses, you can begin to create an enriching experience that is immersive, inclusive, and memorable. A multi-sensory experience takes into account a number of things. For example, it takes into account that people perceive and process art differently. It breaks down barriers that you would have otherwise permitted someone from engaging with your artwork. So for example, you could pair audio description, so that visual to verbal translation that I've been modeling, with perhaps material samples from the artwork itself. So maybe it's impossible for someone to touch your artwork, but you could maybe get a piece of felt or enamel or epoxy or something to give that participant, that viewer, an experience of what's in front of them. Or you could create an artwork intended to be touched, right? But that's a feat in and of itself, because you have to think through a number of factors, like not only is someone who is maybe blind or partially sighted going to touch my artwork, but there's also children who might touch the artwork that might not have the most gentlest of a touch. So then how do you navigate that? Or maybe there's also going to be a range of people with various disabilities touching your artwork. So do they want to pick it up, or do they just want to touch it on a pedestal? So there's a number of factors to think through with tactile replicas. A multi-experience can enhance understanding interpretation. So for example, a particular element of the artwork could evoke a memory, or a sound, smell, or texture could give insight into an artist's intentions, or even allow a viewer to get to know the artist. So maybe they chose a smell that related to their hometown, or a sound that they used to hear walking down the street in New York, something to connect or provide that connection for that viewer. Multi-sensory experience finally can enhance artistic expression by expanding boundaries and provide an avenue to explore complex themes. So for example, thinking through how someone will engage with your work tactily may push you to create a larger sculpture. Normally, Small sculptures are hard for people to touch and understand what they're touching, especially if there's details. So going on a larger scale may be a challenge for you, but it's one that you welcome. Or visual elements may be restricted to convey certain elements. So like if you want to provoke a memory of home, maybe you include the clean laundry scent, or you want to provoke the smell after it rains. So thinking through certain ways of how you want to convey those messages, and then which senses you may want to touch upon in order to convey that message. So at this point, I wanted to present a video to you all of a user who is a blind actor, podcast host, and social media influencer, Anthony S. Ferraro. And he is in the Louvre, and he is experiencing their tactile room for the first time. And hopefully the audio works.
Fine, let's go to the Louvre. We're not going to be able to see anything. They're supposed to have this tactile room with braille and sculptures. Really, I do not like art museums. There's a braille tactile map. Actually feel the Mona Lisa. I didn't know this was going to be possible. This key tells you what each material is. The braille's in France, but that's okay. I get to keep it with me the whole tour so I can see what everything feels like. Do the tactile room. I think this is it. Is it, dude? There's braille on the side. Le Freud du Bronze. It's made out of bronze. Does that mean the step? Yo, wait, what do these do? Louis the 14th? You are a splendid statue. Bro, look at those curls. What is this? This is really cool because it describes everything and then you get to touch it. And there's so much braille.
Can you feel the wings on my back?
Yeah, I do feel the wings on your back. You're the Mona Lisa.
Down left. Feel on his toes.
Oh my God. Place feels unreal. Looks cool. Mona Lisa. Mona Lisa. Just so Louvre-ly. That was one Louvre.
All right. So I included that video for a number of reasons, because it shows the engagement of two senses, touch and sound. So Anthony was able to feel tactile replicas that were made in the material of the original artwork, which doesn't always happen, excuse me. He was able to feel a tactile map of the Mona Lisa. So you saw the outlines of the Mona Lisa, but then each element of the Mona Lisa had a different texture. And that texture was also notified or included in the key beside the Mona Lisa, so that the blind user or someone who was reading Braille would be able to associate a certain texture with a certain point on that painting. So if they wanted to find the clothing, they may find one texture. If they wanted to feel the face, they would find another texture, and so on. And he was also reading Braille labels. So not only was there a high contrast label, but there was also Braille right underneath it. Sometimes you might even find Braille over top the lettering. It's just dependent on your circumstance. But then he also had the opportunity of touching the tactile replica and hearing audio description at the same time. So that was specifically in relation to when he was touching the wings of what I'm assuming is an angel. He was hearing the audio description at the same time, which was reinforcing what he was touching. Obviously, he's at the Louvre. They probably have an incredible accessibility budget. So this is just kind of an example to show you how a blind user would interact with the space and how they could potentially take things like a tactile map, Braille labels, or even a tactile replica and use it to engage with your artwork or even the artwork in an exhibition. So that video didn't touch upon smell and taste. So I wanted to bring examples of my own work to perhaps provide you with some inspiration. So I engage the five senses in various programs. So on the top right is an image taken from the Creative Impressions program that I lead with my colleague that is catered to people with memory loss and their care partners. And then in the bottom right-hand corner is taken from the virtual sensory journey program through art that is designed for people who are blind or partially sighted. In both cases, these participants are not touching the artwork. So we, for the Creative Impressions program, bring the artwork to them. So we're bringing a printed replica. And then for the virtual sensory journey, we are providing a slideshow like I am tonight. So there are avenues in which we've explored in order to provide a connection for viewers and participants of these programs. And we do that through engaging the other senses. So for the memory care program, we've started doing tactile replicas. So I am by no means Claude Monet. So you can see a version of a tactile replica where we have translated familiar feelings, familiar touches. So the rocky cliffs, we use kind of aquarium pebbles. And then we used for the water, the crinkly paper that you use to wrap gift baskets, which ironically have the same kind of noise or reminiscent noise of waves crashing. And then felt for the clouds, shows kind of that evokeness of softness. And then along with the tactile replicas, we include things like rocks because the beach at Etretat is pebbled. We included seashells because everybody at one point in their life, or maybe I'm just generalizing, was an avid seashell collector. So there's memories that are associated with that. Sand that we keep in baggies because sand can be messy. And then we've done a number of things for taste that also have associated smells. So seaweed snacks are great for tasting, but they also kind of have that salty air quality. We've also done salted potato chips and then French fries as well. Because the beach at Etretat today, a famous snack to eat there is French fries. For sound, we have an actual clip from the beach of the waves crashing onto the shore. So we provide this kind of immersive experience, even though the participants are not able to necessarily touch the work, we're still providing avenues in which they can learn about the work and connect with it according to the way that they process artwork. And this format can be replicable for people with and without disabilities. We've adapted this program for groups of children who are medically fragile, or also groups for people with Down syndrome or other similar conditions. And it could also benefit a person without a disability as well, because who doesn't like to touch things in a space where you're normally not allowed to touch, or smell or eat? So it's also providing this another way to connect with art that you might not traditionally have thought about before. So with the remaining slides, I wanted to explore where to begin. And this is a huge hurdle for a lot of people because there's so much to do and there's not a lot of time. Also, cost can be a prohibitive factor because accessibility can take a long time to do, and it can also be costly depending on what you want to do. And I will elaborate tonight on some tips and tricks that have zero associated cost. And then Liz will send out a PDF following this to kind of solidify what we go over tonight, but specifically in relation to Instagram and Facebook posts and making them accessible. So starting with marketing, thinking about your audience and the marketing to the greatest sized audience possible. So basic, simple design. We all love very design-oriented posts, but they're not always the most legible. So keeping in mind that your background and your text do not compete. Your font type. The best font types are sans serif or serif fonts. And on the right side of your screen are examples of those that might look familiar to you. There's Arial, Verdana, Times New Roman, I would stick to Arial, Verdana, or Calibri. But if you have the budget, there are things like dyslexia fonts, which you can also purchase to further promote legibility. Font size. It's recommended not to go below a 14 or 12 to 14 point type. 18 is considered large print. Obviously, there are things to consider when you are doing printed versus digital. With digital, you have the ability sometimes to zoom in, but I wouldn't always rely on that, right? It's thinking universally. Having that extra step to zoom in is not necessarily the most accessible. So if you can create a design with a larger font size, do it. Marketing continued. So high contrast, this goes along with simple design. High contrast simply means that you have a strong variation between the text and your background colors. If the text is dark, you use a lighter background, and vice versa. And on the right is a table with examples of good and bad contrast. In the top left corner is the square with the red contrast. Red, ironically, is the least accessible color. It is very hard to achieve high contrast with red, and many diseases cause the ability for you to not see red, or it be very hard to see red. So I would stay away from red when possible. Second, make sure your marketing is screen reader friendly. So a screen reader is a device that is typically used by someone who is blind or partially sighted. So digital materials such as flyers, for example, or anything that you send via email should be formatted in logical reading order. And if applicable, hyperlinks should be functioning, and the link and the word in which you're hyperlinking should make sense. There's also things like alt text and image descriptions, which should be present when applicable. And think about communicating in multiple formats. So if you are communicating about an event change, not only are you posting it on social media, but you're also sending it out to your participants or your audience that you want to engage. If you're talking about an exhibition opening that you're excited about, you're doing that same kind of communication where you're hitting those on social media, but you're also hitting your listserv with that information as well. I don't know if we still send out those exhibition postcards anymore, but if you do, maybe you send out those to your friends and your family. But always keep in mind that if you are posting on social media, you're not solely posting that very important information in stories. Stories are not screen reader compatible because they do not allow you to include things like alt text or image descriptions. And they're also temporary. So if you are posting important information, always post that information as a post rather than a story so that you are creating the largest audience possible. Now, I mentioned alt text and image descriptions. Some of you might not be familiar with that, right? So alt text is the short visual description that provides a general sense of the content of an image. So it is traditionally structured as a sentence fragment, and it should be less than 15 words. It can be enabled in the settings of your Instagram and your Facebook, and it is only accessible via screen reader. You may have seen alt text if a website did not load, for example, and you saw a blank square with a sentence in the center. That was most likely alt text. Image descriptions are more detailed visual descriptions that elaborate on the most important details of an image. They vary in length depending on the complexity of the image, and it can be added to a post or it can be in a comment section as long as it's in the vicinity. So for example, a website would be great if the image description maybe was positioned under the image if possible or next to it. And then that is accessible to both a screen reader and the public. So it will load, or hopefully load, when you search a website. an example of an alt text and image description I poached from the Durham Art Guild Instagram. So an alt text example for the post on the right reads, a reminder to apply for the Durham Art Guild's 2024 Members Showcase. The image description reads, alternating rectangles form a square, beginning in the top left corner from right to left and top to bottom. The Durham Art Guild logo appears in white text against an electric blue background. The rectangles excuse me, I got lost. The rectangle to the immediate right has a light gray background. It reads, share a piece of your artwork in our annual non-juried free artist member exhibition. Below is a rectangle with a red background that spans the length of the design horizontally. It reads 2024 Members Showcase. Below are 2 additional rectangles. On the left is a purple rectangle with bright lettering that reads Truist Gallery, June 14th to July 19th. The rectangle to the right has a light gray background and reads applications due 5.31.24, durhamartguild.org. All rectangles have a faded repeated DAG logo positioned at a diagonal. And then your beautiful, positioned at a, all rectangles have a faded repeated DAG logo positioned on a diagonal. So that's just an example of an alt text and image description. The alt text you would not see, it would be formatted within the image that you posted, but then the image description would go in the post's comments or in the caption with your information related to this event. Captioning. So if you are doing a video, for example, captioning makes a video accessible to a person who is deaf or hard of hearing. Captions refer to the text version of speech plus a description of a sound that is displayed at the bottom edge of the video. It is synchronized with action. There are 2 types of captioning. There is open captioning, which is embedded into a video, so it always is present. You cannot turn it off. Closed captioning can be turned off because it's on a separate track. So you might be most familiar with closed captioning. That option is familiar or most often used on YouTube. If you hover over the video, the closed captioning icon should be presented in that bar where you can scroll and determine your location of a video. And you can turn it on and off depending. There's also captioning available on Zoom. So captioning is widely available and is a frequently used accommodation. And it's not just used for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. People who have processing disorders also benefit from this accommodation, along with others who may just like reading the words while you speak. And then moving out of marketing and ending with thinking through your artist statements and labels. So something that is commonly not thought about is the average reading level of Americans, and legibility and accessibility come into play here. So the average American reads at a 7th to 8th grade reading level. And organizations and museums have different requirements for the number of words, but typically museums follow 150 words or less. So not only should you keep in mind how high you should hang your labels, but also how many words you should be including in your labels so that you are able to not only make sure that the average reading level is thought about, but you're making sure that you're able to include those labels in high print or or large print font, excuse me. So that's something that I wanted to end on. This image was taken from an exhibition that I curated in 2022 at the Meredith Art Department Gallery, and it included braille labels and audio description. And it also follows the format of an accessible layout, keeping in mind that the wheelchair space clearance is larger than 30 inches, and a chair with an armrest is central. So thank you so much for joining us tonight via Zoom. I appreciate the time that I have spent with you all. I open it up to any questions. This by no means was a comprehensive accessibility overview. That's impossible to do in an hour. So if you have any questions, please let me know. You're welcome to email me. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining us.